Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Gabby, and today we're going to be discussing some books that have changed my life. I know that sounds very dramatic when I say it that way, and I feel like this list of books, each one of these books have changed my life or impacted my life in different ways for different reasons. You know, some of them are a lot more deep than others, but all of these books on this list have completely changed my life in one way or another. I actually did a video like this one of my first years here on YouTube, and I've been wanting to make an updated video like this for so long now, and today I'm finally gonna get the chance to do that. But before we do jump into today's video, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Book of the Month for sponsoring today's video, because Book of the Month has also been very life-changing. Do you see how I tied that in there? Do you see how it connects? Because Book of the Month is a super popular and fast-growing online book service for readers. Their mission is to promote new and emerging authors and help readers discover the books that they love. So how this works is that their team vets the hundreds of new releases that come out every month because, you know, as an average typical reader human, I don't want to be sorting through hundreds of new releases trying to figure out what the coolest, newest things are. And that's where Book of the Month comes in, because their team picks the top few that they think their audience would be the most interested in. Some months they have 5 selections, some months they have even more than that. It's nice because you can spend more time reading instead of trying to research all the new titles that are coming out. It's really nice as well because Book of the Month is risk-free and you can skip any month with no penalties. So if for whatever reason you're not feeling any of the selections that month, you can skip and you will not be charged. But honestly, almost all of the times they have some of my most anticipated books of the year as selections, and I get so excited. It's literally one of the highlights of my month to see what the monthly selections for Book of the Month are gonna be. Like, that itself honestly has been really life-changing. Like, I can't even imagine, like, what was my life like before Book of the Month? I don't know. Plus, they have the best prices for new hardcover fiction books, because right now if you walk into any local bookstore, they're gonna have new hardcover books for anywhere from like $26 even up to $30 sometimes. But this month, when you use my code gabbyreads, you'll get your first book for just $9.99. Like, the fact that they are still having this deal for signups is absolutely incredible, and I think you should take advantage of it while it lasts. This month, one of the books that I chose for my selection is Mame by Jessica George, and this one is a contemporary fiction debut. This one just says coming of age is hard work, but this heartwarming story of self-discovery has plenty of laughs and wisdom to spare too. And then this month they also have The Writing Retreat by Julia Bartz as a pick, which this is a new release thriller that I am so excited to read. This one involves a writer's retreat, which I love books that follow writers, like one of my favorite things. And then it also has this like winter stormy vibes atmosphere. I cannot wait to read this. Definitely be sure to use the link down in my description to go and check out Book of the Month. And you know, who knows, it might be a little life-changing when you do discover Book of the Month, because Book of the Month has honestly changed my life in such a great way. Like, I love Book of the Month so freaking much. Thank you so much to Book of the Month for sponsoring today's video, and now let's get on to the rest of the life-changing books, shall we? Okay, so the first book that I have on this list of books that have changed my life, if you know my channel pretty well, this will probably be no surprise, but it's Gone Girl, because this book is a book that I read in early 2014, and this book changed my life completely, because before this book, I didn't consider myself that much of an avid reader. Like, before I read this book, I would probably average maybe like 10, maybe 15 books in a whole year was like my average for how often I would read books. And then after reading Gone Girl in January of 2014, in the year of 2014, I read 77 books. That was the year that I got obsessed with reading. Like, I really became an avid reader, and I really credit my reading joy to Gone Girl. Like, Gone Girl hooked me from the start. Gone Girl was one of the, you know, first thriller books that I ever read, and after reading this book, I could not get enough. Like, I was seeking out any thrilling book ever. Like, I wanted something that would live up to Gone Girl for me. It's so weird for me to try and imagine like what my reading life would look like right now if I never picked up Gone Girl, because Gone Girl really changed a lot of things for me in my reading life. Like, I became an avid reader because of Gone Girl, and I think that's pretty incredible. So yeah, Gone Girl. I think even if you have read a lot of thrillers, I still think Gone Girl is a very enjoyable read, and I just highly recommend it. Like, this could be the book that gets you into thrillers. If you're not sure if you're into thrillers or not, I think it's such a well-written book anyways that any kind of reader could enjoy this book, you know? The next book on this list is going to be We Are the Ants by Sean David Hutchinson, because this is a book that I read back when it came out in 2016, and this story is kind of like a young adult sci-fi-ish, contemporary-ish story about this young boy named Henry, and Henry Henry is just really going through a lot of depression and a lot of grief in this book because his boyfriend has recently killed himself, and now he's being abducted by these aliens who are telling him that the world is going to end, and that if he wants to prevent the end of the world, all he has to do is press this red button. But because he's going through such a depression, he doesn't know if the world is worth saving. And I feel like this book changed my life. Like, as soon as I started the opening chapter of this book, I just got this feeling that this book was going to impact me in a way that not a lot of books have. And I was correct in that feeling. Like, this book went on to become one of my all-time favorites because of the feeling, the way it made me feel. It was just hard to explain. When I read this book in 2016, I was going through a really weird time, you know, like I had just moved to Washington. I didn't have that many friends. I was feeling very alone. I was in school and I wasn't sure what I was doing. I kind of like hated where I was at in life when I read this book, and I connected so much to Henry's character and his feelings of like depression and loneliness and isolation, and this book just really spoke to me. And I feel like this book is one of those books that reminds you what life is and like why life is so valuable. And you know, it's like you can look at things and say like nothing matters because we are all just like the ants, like we're all just like little specks in the universe and like nothing really matters. But you can also look at that as like, let's live our lives because nothing really matters, you know? Sorry, I don't want to get too deep with this, but like this book just means everything to me, and I do think that this book changed my life in a way that it changed my perspective on some things, and I think that's really powerful and really beautiful. The next book on this list of books that changed my life has got to be A Little Life by Anya Yanagihara. And this book, I mean, gosh, I feel like anybody who reads this book would confidently say that this book did change their life in some way or another. I feel like I hesitate to recommend this book widely because this book is so triggering and so sad and so depressing that I don't think, you know, like if you're not in a really great place mentally, I don't recommend reading this because it's so tough. Like, it is such a hard book to read. You know, I feel like a lot of the books on this list, it's one of those things where like I read it at a perfect time in my life where I really needed something like this, you know, because I actually read this book the week that we had to put my dog down, which was totally unexpected, by the way. Like, I was not thinking that that was going to be happening while I was reading this, but you know, this book is 800 pages long. It took me about a week to get through it, and in the middle of that week we had to put my dog down. So like, just add to the overall sadness I was feeling and going through while reading this. But honestly, it just left such a long-lasting impression on me because of all the hurt and the pain that I was going through in my own life while I was reading this book. And you know, this story, it just follows this young man named Jude, and it kind of follows him and his three closest friends throughout a long period of time in his life. And this is like one of those like literary fiction kind of style of books. And you know, when I was reading this book, I was starting to, you know, I was at that point in my life where I was starting to get really close friends, but I still wasn't having any romantic relationships, and I really felt like there was something fucking like wrong with me because of that. And I feel like this book really changed my life because of the way that it talks about friendships, and the way that this book really normalizes, like, you know, why can't we just have friendships? Like, why is that not enough? Like, why do things have to be romantic? And almost kind of saying how in a way friendships are maybe even more powerful sometimes than romantic relationships because you rely on each other for different things, you know, like you're constantly there for each other and you're each other's support even through everything without that romantic element, and how powerful that is. And I don't know, the way that this book talks about grief and depression was really eye-opening for me. I think it was just so beautiful and so heartbreaking to read something like this. But gosh, I could go on all day about A Little Life. Like, I know people like have their issues with this book, and I totally understand that, but for me personally, like, this was just such an experience for me. I'll never forget this book. I don't know if I could ever reread it again because of the, you know, emotional shit that I went through while reading this, but this book definitely stands out as a book that has changed my life in so many ways. The next book on this list is going to be The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, which this is another, you know, young adult contemporary that I read probably back when it came out in like 2015, 2016 times. I don't want to say that I had my head in the sand when it came to certain things that were going on in America during that time, but you know, around the time that this book came out, it was like one of my first few years of college, and I feel like I was starting to get a better understanding of the world during that time. Like, again, it's not like I had my head in the sand, but I definitely wasn't as aware of the things that were happening in the world as I am now. And this was the first book that I had ever read that deals with police brutality, and like specifically police brutality against people of color. This book just really opened my eyes, you know, like not just in the sense of like police brutality, but like the specific and unique struggles that Black people can face when growing up in America. It just really opened my eyes to things that I had never considered before, and like I had never really really thought about white privilege and like what that means specifically before I had read this book. And so I think this book really just opened my eyes. It was such an educational experience to read this book. And you know, the fact that this book and books like this are getting banned in America right now, I think is honestly so horrifying and just goes to show how powerful books like this are, because people are scared. You know, like people are literally scared for people to read things like this because then they're afraid that they're gonna like be more educated about things that are going on. And you know, it's really scary to me that they're trying to ban books like this, because books like this are so powerful. And I think the more that the youth can be reading things like this, the more that they'll grow up knowing so much more, you know, because like if I had read this when I was a lot younger, I feel like I would have been paying attention to these things a lot younger in my life. And so for all of those reasons, I think The Hate You Give was such a powerful, such a beautiful story that really opened my eyes to things. And I feel like this book was life-changing, not just because of the awareness that it gave me about, you know, America and the state of the world, but also just because the characters are so good in this book. They're so wholesome. I love the relationship she has with her dad. It's a really, really solid book. Highly recommend if you have not read The Hate You Give. I don't know what you're doing. Read The Hate You Give. All right, the next book that I have on this list is going to be Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell, which was definitely a book that changed my life. And I feel like this one also has a lot to do with like I read it at the perfect time of my life, because I read this book in 2014 and at that time I was a freshman in college, like Kath in this book. At the time when I read this, I think Kath was the most relatable character that I had ever read in a book. Not just because of like the whole thing where it's like perfectly timed that she's also happens to be, you know, a college freshman in this book. Like she was the same age as me, going through the same things as me, going through the same anxieties about college, but the fact that she also like has her twin sister who she's like so fucking close to, and like me and Rachel are not twins, but everybody mistakes us for being twins all the time, and like me and Rachel are just as close as probably most twins are. Like me and Rachel are really fucking close, you know? And the fact that, you know, she talks about how her and her sister used to write these fanfics together, and then Kath in this book, you know, she deals with the fact that she's kind of awkward and she doesn't know how to come out of her shell, and she's just interested in like writing fanfiction alone in her room and not really wanting to talk to people. And I just related so fucking hard to Kath. I mean, I still do. I still really do. And that's why I think this is like one of my most reread books of all time, because it's so comforting for me to be in the mind of Kath, because it just feels like home. Like it just feels like how I think, you know? I also just love the way that Kath describes, you know, like what it's like to be a fangirl in this book, because I feel like I've never related more to something also because I'm a die-hard fangirl. Like when I love something, like say Taylor Swift or with like BTS these days, I don't know how to be a casual fan, you know? Like I'm one of those fans where like it consumes all of my thoughts. Like being a fangirl is an all-consuming full-time hobby, and I feel like Kath just really understands that in this book, which is something that I've never come across in like any books that I've ever read. And I just love the way there's that one quote in this book that has really stuck with me through the years, because she says real life was something happening in her peripheral vision. Like she's so into her fandom and her little like fantasy world in her fanfiction that like real life is something that she's not even paying attention to. Like it's just happening on the sidelines, and I feel like I've never connected more with the character than with those lines, because I was like, I fucking get it, you know? Like there are days where I'm just like, I am not even gonna pay attention to real life because all I care about is being a fan right now. So Kath is just like one of those all-time relatable characters for me. This is such a comfort book for me. I just love it so much. All right, and then the next book that's on this list is going to be Loveless by Alice Oseman. And if you weren't around on my channel back when I read this book for a reading vlog, this is a book that literally means so much to me because of the asexual representation in this book. And at the time that I had read this book, I wasn't exactly sure like how I identified sexually. Like I was still kind of trying to figure things out, but I always felt like I probably was asexual. And after reading this book, you know, our protagonist in this book is asexual. Her name's Georgia, and you know, she kind of talks about how she's struggled her whole life with like never really feeling connections with like love and romance, but she always has like wanted those things. Like she can imagine those things for herself and she thinks about them, but then when the situations are actually happening, she just feels so uncomfortable and so disgusted. And I've never ever been able to vocalize these feelings before, and that's why I think it's so freaking powerful to read a book with a main character that you identify with in those kinds of ways, because I feel like it can really help you vocalize things that you didn't really know how to say yourself, or like things that you're feeling that you don't really know how to vocalize. Even though it hurts, you know, this book is kind of like brutally honest in a way where it kind of feels like I'm reading my diary sometimes, and I just feel like if you feel like you might be asexual or you want to learn more about asexuality and what it means, I would highly recommend reading this book, because this definitely opened my eyes, and I feel like this has got to be one of my most like annotated books like of all time. Oh my god, there's something about this book. I appreciate too the way that Georgia talks about how much she loves like reading about romance, you know, because that's the whole thing with like a lot of times people don't understand. They're like, well, if you're asexual, then like why do you like reading romance so much or whatever? And it's like, I feel so seen by Georgia, because she's like, yeah, I love reading about romance and I love watching romance, but for some reason when it happens to me, I'm like, absolutely not. And just the way that she describes those feelings, I've never seen it before in a book, you know, so this book just meant everything to me. Like, it's so special to me. All right, the next book on this list is going to be a very recent fave of mine, because it's going to be We Spread by Ian Reid, which you might recognize this as my favorite book of 2022. Like, this was my #1 pick for all the books that I read last year, and that's because I do feel like in a lot of ways this book did change my life and has already kind of changed my life, because this is a horror book, you know, and so I was not expecting to feel all of the feels for a horror book, but I think this book just really touches on something that I didn't even realize that I was so afraid of personally, and that's, you know, the idea of aging and starting to lose yourself as you age. Like, that is something that just like really scares me, like really strikes a nerve with me. I feel like if you are someone who, you know, has someone in your family who like has dementia or even like Alzheimer's, like I think this book might hit you 10 times harder, because I can't even imagine. You know, in this story, we're just following this woman named Penny who, you know, she's getting to that age where she's gonna have to be moved to a home to be like looked after, and she doesn't know if she can trust the people that are looking after her in this home. And I think the idea of that is so scary, obviously, because it's like you don't know if you can rely on yourself anymore, and so you start to get suspicious of the people around you because it feels like time is passing, but you don't have a grasp on time anymore. The whole idea of this book is just so horrifying and so scary that it just really got to me. Like, this book made me cry like a bitch. Like, I cannot even believe the way that I cried at the end of this book. Like, this does not happen very often for me, and it definitely changed my life because it made me think of my life in a different way, and really made me think about like, what is my life gonna look like when I am that age, you know, and like, what am I gonna do if I start like not like losing my sense of self? Like, that is such a scary thing for me. But this book was also so eye-opening for me in a way as well, when it comes to like the way that we as a society treat the elderly, and how we kind of strip them of their individuality as they age as well, and like we're responsible for that too, because we start to treat the elderly as like a collective group as opposed to individuals. And just the whole conversation about that in this book I thought is just so powerful and so well done, and this is just a book that I continue to think about every single day. Like, the amount of writing that I did at the end of this book, like, I've never written so much in an actual copy of my book before. Like, I had so many thoughts, I had to get it all down on paper, and like that doesn't happen to me very often, and that's how I know for sure that this book was incredibly life-changing, very impactful. Okay, these next few will be a little bit less serious because, you know, you guys are probably like, wow, you're getting real deep in this video, like real deep. And sorry, I keep moving around, but the lighting keeps changing in my room and I'm freaking out. Okay, anyways, the next book on this list is going to be Wild, and this is one that I just kind of read on a whim last year. I read this book because I was reading it for a video where I was reading, you know, book recommendations for Capricorns. I was not expecting to enjoy this book as much as I did. This is the only nonfiction book that I have on this list because this book just really inspired something in me that not a lot of books have. To give you some context, you know, like, I'm originally from California. I lived in California for the first 20 years of my life, and then when I was 20, I moved to Washington with my family, and so I'm very familiar with like the West Coast, you know, of the United States, and this book is really really fascinating, you know, because we're following this woman who's going to be hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, which, first of all, I had never even heard of that, even though I live on the West Coast. Like, how embarrassing. But it's basically this trail that goes from California through Oregon all the way up to Washington, and it's kind of talking about her experience with, like, being alone in nature and trying to overcome these things. You know, she's kind of going through a hard time in this book because her mom has recently passed away, and she's just kind of dealing with this, like, identity crisis of, like, not really knowing who she is, and she's kind of feeling lost. And so she decides to take this journey, like, by herself that's going to take, like, a long time. And the fact that this is a true story is just so inspiring to me. You know, after reading this book, I just felt like I wanted so desperately to connect more with nature, because I feel like even though I've been living in Washington for like nearly 7 years now, I still feel like I haven't really been going out and like being in nature as much as I probably should. Like, I'm such a homebody that like I don't even think about it most of the time. I'm just like always indoors and always at home. But it's like I live in one of the most beautiful states in the country, and like everything's so green and so beautiful, and there's water everywhere, and like this book just really inspired me to want to get out there and become more of like an outdoorsy person. I even, like, after I finished reading this book, I fucking bought like hiking boots, like nice hiking boots, because I was like determined. And I feel like in a lot of ways, ever since reading this book, I do feel a lot more connected to nature than I did before, because before I would just be like, oh, the outdoors is so like, whatever. And now I like look forward to it, you know, like I like going out to the parks by myself and just kind of like enjoying the day by myself. And I really do like credit this book to a lot of those feelings, you know? Another book that definitely changed my life, but this is a lot less serious than the rest of the books on this list, is The Troop by Nick Cutter, because you might not know this, but before I read The Troop, I was not that much of a horror reader. I read horror maybe like once every couple of months, you know, like I was always interested in horror, but I never read that much of it. And then after I read The Troop, which happened in about, I want to say it was like April 2020, it was like early 2020, and then after reading The Troop, I got obsessed with horror. Like, horror became one of my favorite genres after reading this book. And so I definitely think I can credit The Troop for getting me really into horror. I mean, before this, I had read Pet Sematary at like the very end of 2019, and that one definitely made me more interested. Like, after reading Pet Sematary, that was when I like made the decision that like, oh, I actively want to be picking up more Stephen King and like more horror in general. But then after reading The Troop, you know, right after that in April, that is when I really like took off with like my horror obsession. Like, I started to pick up horror books like all the time. I started making, you know, a lot of reading vlogs that were dedicated to horror books, and that just wasn't a thing for me before The Troop. And so I really do credit The Troop to getting me into horror, even though I know this is such a weird one, because you're probably like, God, The Troop is just so gross and so awful, but I freaking love The Troop. Like, the body horror in this book was just next level for me. I just thought this was so genuinely terrifying, and I think the fact that I read this book right at the start of the pandemic, I think really had a like major impact on me and why it was so scary for me, because this book definitely involves something that feels like a virus that's like spreading. But God, The Troop was incredible. The Troop was absolutely life-changing. I literally named my book club the Book Troop kind of after this book. So, I mean, totally life-changing for me. All right, the second to last book that I have on this list is actually going to be The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. And I think this book was totally life-changing for me because, you know, before I had read this book, I was like, I am not a historical fiction girly, okay? And like, to be honest, I'm still not, okay? I'm really not. But after reading this book, you know, this was something that was so outside of my comfort zone. Like, I was positive on the fact that I was not going to enjoy this book because I don't like historical fiction usually, and I also don't like books that take place around a war, like during a war time period. Like, I could care less. It bores me to tears. I don't like reading about war. But there was something about this book and, you know, the relationship between these two sisters that I was obsessed with this. Like, it was such a beautiful and heart-wrenching book that, you know, I remember after finishing this book, I was looking up like Kristen Hanna's entire backlist. Like, I wanted to read everything she'd ever come out with. I was also like actively searching for books that took place during World War II after reading this book. Like, I completely changed as a reader right after finishing this book. And I feel like that alone right there just goes to show how all it takes sometimes is one book to like completely change your life and like change your reading taste in a way, right? Because, you know, with books like The Troop and The Nightingale, it's like these are the books that impacted my reading in a way that like I didn't think I could enjoy this genre as much as I do with this book, and that's why it's so powerful to me. I mean, to be fair, I do think that The Nightingale was more of like a one-hit wonder for me when it comes to like war and historical fiction books, because to this day I still really don't enjoy books in that genre, but this was an amazing experience and it proved to me that sometimes I can, you know, and that's why it was so powerful for me. And then the last book that I have on this list for books that have changed my life is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. And this is a book that I actually did read a little bit later on in my life, you know. I feel like a lot of people read Little Women when they were a lot younger, but I actually read this for the first time in 2020. Like, I did a whole reading vlog of my experience reading this book, and I actually was not even motivated to read this book until after I had seen the movie with like the Greta Gerwig adaptation, and you know, with Saoirse Ronan as Jo March. Like, that movie was everything, and I like sobbed, and I loved the movie so much. I actually saw the movie in theaters on my 25th birthday for the first time, and it could not have been a more perfect thing for me to do on my birthday because I connected with that movie so much. I feel like Jo March is one of those characters who are just like a once in a lifetime really relatable character for me. I just really love her like independence and the way she craves her freedom, and there's just something so inspiring to me about Jo March and her character. But this book means so much to me, not just because Jo March and her character is so incredible, but also because, you know, I feel like this is one of the first books that I had ever read that takes place in like the early 1800s, or that was written in the 1800s, and I was convinced that I would not be able to enjoy a book that was written this long ago, you know, because as far as I know, like all of my experience with classics has been like not great, and I was convinced that like I don't think there was a classic out there that I could love that passionately. But then Little Women really proved me wrong. Like, Little Women is definitely like a top tier favorite of mine, and the fact that this book is a classic, it just kind of proved to me that like I shouldn't be writing off all classics. Like, I know there's a lot of classics that would probably bore me to tears, and I do recognize that, but I think Little Women is just something else, you know, like it's just so freaking good. And Jo March is just such a freaking queen, like she's an icon. And so yeah, if you're at all, you know, nervous about the idea of reading Little Women because you don't usually enjoy classics, I would say same, and definitely check out Little Women anyways, because I think Little Women is so freaking great. Right, so those are all of the books that are on my list of books that have changed my life. I feel like I know a lot of these are kind of like more on the deeper or more on the serious side, and I know a lot of these are really personal, you know, to me, because a lot of these are reasons for like characters. Like, there's characters that I really connected with, or like I just feel like I read the book at the perfect time. But I would love to know, you know, like what are your thoughts on some of these books? Were any of these books, you know, also life-changing for you in any way? Or, you know, just like let me know some of your experiences. Like, what are some books that have completely changed your life and why? If you don't mind sharing, I would love to know if you want to leave a comment down below, and thank you so much for watching as always, and I will see you very soon with another video. Bye!